From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. We live in most turbulent times. For only the fourth time in our 240-plus year history, our nation sees its president under investigation for impeachment in the House of Representatives and then possibly tried to be removed from office with a two-thirds vote in the U.S. Senate. To bring some insights and perspective about where we are and where we may be headed, our guest on Inside Politics today is Middle Tennessee State University political science professor and dean of the Aldrich College there, Dr. John Weil. Dr. Weil, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
It seems President Trump has been under the shadow of investigation or the threat of impeachment almost since he took office in January 2017. Why is this current impeachment effort so different than, say, the other investigations that have come up, particularly the Mueller probe? Why does this one seem to be taking more root and making more progress in some ways?
Let me start by saying impeachment has become something of a political weapon since the time of Nixon. I mean, there have been a lot of threatening, and actually, if you go back to Earl Warren,
two of the four have happened since Nixon's time.
That's right. So it's been a little bit more prominent. I think part of the Mueller investigation is Mueller sort of began with the premise that you cannot indict a sitting president, and to his credit,
that's
I suppose,
a Justice Department rule.
Right. That's Justice Department rule. It's not actually ever been litigated in at least not.
But
at the
if you
Supreme
can't
Court
charge
level.
him or bring criminal charges while he's president, the only other alternative, if Congress feels it needs to act, is impeachment.
Right. But if you look at his probe, he kept. It's probably one of the most secretive in American history in terms of he did not leak, and I mean I think there is a good case to be made that there was sufficient evidence of collusion with a foreign power in the Mueller probe that he could have been impeached, but the Republicans certainly were not on board with that.
The current probe seems to focus more towards Ukraine and an effort by the president to ask Ukraine to do public investigations of his political enemies and things that would benefit him in the 2020 election, and that would be a violation of the Constitution. Now, let's talk a little bit with a primer.
Okay.
Under the Constitution, what are the stated grounds that you can impeach a president?
There are two that are relatively clear, and there's one that's a little ambiguous. Bribery and treason are relatively clear, and treason is actually one of the maybe the only crime that's actually defined in the Constitution as making war against the United States or giving aid or comfort to their enemies. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when impeachment was being discussed, George Mason of Virginia proposed that they add maladministration as a possibility for impeachment, and James Madison and others said, well, that's a little too broad. So they substituted a term from English history known as high crimes and misdemeanors, and there had actually been some fairly prominent impeachment of public officials, usually king's age. The king was a...
So maybe at that time they understood what that term meant better than we do today.
Probably so. And I mean, you had... there was always sort of a political dimension to it. I think there's always a notion that it would be criminal-like behavior, but it might not be an indictable offense.
It's a two-step process. How much of that is actually spelled out in the Constitution? It has to begin in the House, and then the Senate has a role, and then so does the Supreme Court, at least the Chief Justice.
Yes. Okay. Good. Yes. It's similar to our criminal justice system in that you have a separate indictment, which is what the grand jury would typically do from your trial. And so the House of Representatives, by majority vote, draws up articles of impeachment, and then for it to go farther, you would have to have half or more of the U.S. House of Representatives to vote on it. And it appears as though we may be, we have a majority of Democrats, and probably we are there now. But the biggest hurdle is this two-thirds majority after his indictment.
After a trial in the Senate.
Right. Then after the indictment in the House, you have the trial in the Senate, and as you rightly pointed out, in the case of a president, now not for judges, but in the case of the president, it's presided over by Chief Justice. So Chief Justice Roberts would be there, just as Rehnquist was.
And at that point, the Chief Justice runs the trial, not the majority leader in the Senate.
That's point, right.
He calls the shots in terms of running the trial.
Right. Now, what's fascinating about impeachment is let's say, counter to some recent elections, particularly the election of 2000, is the Supreme Court has had the Supreme Court has, the couple times it's intervened in impeachment, it's basically intervened to say that the sole power of impeachment, and that's the language in the Constitution, belongs to the Congress. So it's very unlikely, if you were to be impeached and removed from office, it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court would do anything. And if I can add one other thing, impeachment only brings about removal from office, or if the Senate decides or Congress decides, then it can also bar a person from future office, which in the case of Trump probably wouldn't amount to much.
And we'd have to point out that in all the times that impeachment has gone to a trial situation in the Senate, no president has been removed. Andrew Johnson got within one vote of being removed.
That's right. And what's fascinating, in fact, I just reviewed a book on impeachment not too long ago, and the sentiment seems to be shifting a little bit on Andrew Johnson. If you remember, one of the stories in Kennedy's profiles in Courage was about the courageousness of this one person who kept him from being impeached. Scholars are now looking back and saying, Johnson really tried to reverse 3 constitutional amendments. Maybe he should have been impeached or convicted.
The question about the impeachment, the president has raised questions about the fairness of the procedure. He talks about the fact that the hearings that the House are having primarily are behind closed doors, although both parties are participating in those hearings, at least can participate. Does the president have a point? Is the process unfair, even though it's supposed to be akin to a grand jury? Grand juries don't have leaks the way these congressional hearings do.
From his perspective, I'm sure it doesn't seem fair, but what's happening now is not terribly unusual. What may be a little different in terms of those who are remembering recent history, particularly in the Nixon case, you had months of public hearings in Congress before anybody actually began, talking about the impeachment thing, and so that was a little bit more visible.
What do you expect the House to do once they finish these behind closed doors hearings? Do you expect them to have maybe not a lengthy, but a considerable amount of public testimony and finding of facts?
Yes, that's what I anticipate, but things are moving so quickly, and of course in some ways both parties I think would like to have it over before if you have this during an election, it sort of muddles the water.
Well, we're going to get to the election pretty quick. Do you think that means the Democrats sort of have a limit for how long they can keep this going? I mean, don't they have to have this settled before the end of the year, before we actually get into the 2020 election year itself?
Well, they don't have to, but I think that would be their desire. Dr.
John Viles, our guest. He's an MTSU political science professor and dean of the Honors College there. We're talking about the current situation in Washington with the impeachment of the president. We'll be talking about the Syria issue as well. Back to continue our conversation after this break.